Hello and welcome to TLC Talks, produced by the Teaching and Learning Center at North Seattle College. I'm your host, Daniel Tarker, and today we are going to talk to Renee Infelise, a student success and retention specialist in international programs at North Seattle College and within the wider Seattle Colleges district. We're going to talk about student engagement or the challenges of student engagement in an online format. We're going to talk about using theater games to engage students and also the international student experience during COVID-19. So sit back, have a cup of coffee or tea or beverage of your choice, and enjoy what we hope will be an informative and thought-provoking conversation. Renee, tell us a little bit about yourself. What is your role at North Seattle College?
Well, thank you so much for having me, Dan. I really appreciate being here and being a part of the pilot episode of the Teaching and Learning Center podcast. I actually came from an educational sort of nonprofit background, but a lot of that was from my theater degree, which was theater and social justice. And so I've always been incorporating theater into my work, whether it was in nonprofits or higher ed. I moved to Seattle about 5 years ago and started at North in the student life department, which was a great fit for a theater person because a lot of what we do is really creating programs and events similar to putting on a show for students and engaging students, creating a vibrant student life. So that was my job for about 3 years. And for the last 2 years, I've worked in international programs at North Seattle College. And sort of just recently, I transitioned to also working for the whole district, doing student life and engagement work for international students for all 3 Seattle colleges. That's sort of my career in a nutshell. But yeah, it's been great. And I love working at North and for Seattle colleges.
And based on your experience, how are international students coping during this pandemic? What are some themes that have emerged in your conversations with them?
I think much like, most students at North, technology has been the biggest challenge. And I think that's true of our staff as well. But if you don't have a good computer with good high-speed internet, it really does hamper being able to do the work that's required of you online. And so I think what has been especially challenging is that for our students coming from China or who are studying in China, there's often sort of issues with accessing the Seattle College's websites or the right websites that they need to get the materials. So that has also been a challenge. And I think a lot of our students just weren't set up to work from home and do online classes. And for international students especially, the reason that they came to the States and the reason they came to study in the States was to have that in-person experience and to interact with people and experience the culture and the language and the sort of college environment that, that's why they wanted to come, and they're not getting that anymore. And so I think that's been really hard for our international students.
So what strategies are they using to address some of these remote learning challenges?
A lot of them are trying, just like our other students, trying to find ways to connect online. I think many people are just kind of holed up in their rooms right now, like a lot of us are, trying to be COVID safe while also still finding ways to connect. International Programs has provided events, and we have like a weekly social that we do where students can come and interact. And I think that's been helpful. But I think too, a lot of students have decided to go back home because if they're going to be taking classes online and being, sort of homebound, why not be, in their home with their families, take classes from home. So that's been another thing that we've been seeing as well.
And that makes sense. It's cheaper. You don't have to pay rent. And plus, you're at home with your family in case anything happens.
Especially during a pandemic. I mean, I know a lot of people, not just international students, but fellow friends and staff members who went home because if they were going to be doing remote learning or remote working, why not do it from a place where they're surrounded by their loved ones. So
Yeah, you could do it anywhere.
exactly. That's kind of the benefit of it. So now we have a lot of students. Now we have a new challenge where a lot of students are taking classes from home, but now we're dealing with the time difference. Right. So if they're taking a class that's synchronous, we have a lot of students that are staying up till 2, 3 a.m. huddled over their laptop, trying not to wake their parents. And so I say this all the time, but I'm always impressed with international students who leave their home, their families, their friends, their networks to travel thousands of miles to live in a totally different country, to study in a language that's totally different, to write college essays in a whole nother language, which I'm just always amazed at. But then, and I just always am admiring our students' work ethic, but then to see them doing that from their home countries and staying up and, working these late hours to meet their deadlines of their teachers or meet with their group for a group project, it's just amazing.
Yeah, I agree. I've always been very impressed by the perseverance of our international students and the challenges they have to face when they come over here to study abroad. Language barriers, housing, financial. And imagine the pandemic just adds another layer of challenge for them to overcome as well. So it is truly impressive to see their perseverance. And I think this also, in regards to connection, or the need to connect, I think this is a good transition point or a good segue into the idea of using theater games to enhance our engagement with students, which is something that we talked about discussing when we agreed to have this conversation. So as a leader in international programs, what are you doing to engage students using theater games or techniques? And are there any games or activities that you think faculty or other staff members might be able to use to enhance their presentations?
Yeah. Well, I think we've had some really great events. I want to, shout out to International Night, which is actually on YouTube. We did a live stream on YouTube where we did like a talent showcase, kind of like an open mic, but more sort of a like formal presentation of it. And that was really great because students got to submit their own videos. They could record them by themselves in their home, no pressure, and then upload them. And then we showed them on YouTube. And so it was a great way to showcase our international students. But I think anytime you can present art, I'm always all about that. And so to me, that's just a great way to engage students is, having them record something and then presenting it later. But another thing that we've been doing is our weekly social where we do icebreakers. And I think icebreakers are it's a great way to engage students, but it's also a great way to practice your conversational skills. And that's something international students are English language learners, which is like a hot topic. We're always looking at ELL students and ESL students in education, but theater games are just a natural icebreaker in my mind. In thinking about engaging students, you want to think about building community, right? And icebreakers do that. And so many of the icebreakers we know come from theater. Like they're theater games, and they're ways to make students be creative. And so one of the ones I really love is I call it show and tell. I'm sure there's plenty of variations on the name, but where students will take an object from their desk area or their house. I'm holding up a sort of, one of those like stress balls in the shape of a football. And then you ask them to tell a story about it. And the story can be true or false, but you have them tell a story. And the audience or the other students have to guess, is it true or not?
Oh, nice.
So it's like, this football stress ball was given to me by my dad when we went to go see the Niners game. And it was, it was like the most, memorable time in my young life because my dad really showed me how much he loved me in that day. And then everyone has to figure out, is that true or not? And I think that also helps students like think creatively, think outside the box. We get to know them a little bit more if the story is true or not. And so that's one of my favorites.
Yeah, I love that one. That one reminds me of the game Two Truths and a Lie. It's kind of in the same wheelhouse.
Yeah, same idea, right? We get to know you a little bit, even if you're telling a lie, because the lie gives you a little insight. And so I think part of what's been challenging in COVID is we're not really getting to know people in the same ways that we did. And so activities like that, I think, really help break down those barriers that we have online.
And what this brings to mind to me is how, as a good reminder of why it's especially important online and also in face-to-face environments to really work on engaging students when you're doing presentations, whether it's in the classroom when you're teaching a class or whether you're doing a presentation as part of your job in student services or any place on campus or any department you might work for. How important it really is to think about what strategies you're using to build community and relationships with students. And again, I think it's especially important in this online environment where everyone feels very disconnected.
Yeah. And I think too, right, so much of what we do is collaborative and there's so many group projects. And even if as a teacher or a facilitator, you're maybe not leading the whole class or the whole group in it, putting people into breakout rooms and having them do it on their own, then inherently will create this group dynamic that group now is bonded through this activity. And so I think, again, it's sort of like, how can we connect? And if we're going to be working in groups, we will work better if we are connected on a level that is not just like, here's the project. Project A is this, you do that, right? Like if we're connected on that human level. So
I find myself wanting to channel the listeners who might be saying to themselves, well, it's all fine and good to talk about engagement and online learning and presentations. But how do you really get students to engage, especially when some of them appear very hesitant to engage, who might not even turn on their cameras? So how do you do that? How do you make students really engage when you are trying to reach out to them?
Oh, I knew the camera question would come up. That's always one of those like, oh, but how are we engaging if your camera's not on? And so I found that using the chat function or the screen share function really has been beneficial because I don't think we should expect to like require our students to turn on their cameras. There are so many obstacles to just technology and accessibility, as well as sort of any number of conditions that might make it hard, or there might be obstacles for why that student can't turn on the camera. However, being able in the show and tell example, and that if we take that as the example, being able to type a story in a chat, being able to screen share a photo on the screen, you could still do both of those. The student wouldn't have to talk, the student wouldn't have to turn on their camera, but they're still engaging. And for those of us who do this work, we know there's always going to be that one student that will sort of carry the in-person stuff. Right. Or that one person, if you've ever done a workshop, that's always, and it's me, let's be honest, right? But it's always like, yeah, we're like, hello, yes, we'll talk. Okay, I'll read that out loud, and having those sort of guidelines in place ahead of time, then also make it easier for people to share. I always invite students to type things into the chat. We did in our weekly social last week, we did a music share out, which went really well. And it was students either showed videos, like shared their screen and showed a music video, or typed sort of songs and artists into the chat of, like just what they're listening to. And we just kind of listened to music and watched music videos. And there was quite a few that were active and talking. And then, there's people who are just watching and listening. And there are some people who engaged in the chat. And to me, those are all levels of engagement, even the lurkers, so to speak, right? Like, because I've been that person in a meeting where I just didn't have the energy to turn on the camera or do anything. But being there, I think, if we can get them in the space, I think that's a level of engagement that we want to give credit to people for.
Agreed. And I think Food and music are two of the topics that animate people the most during the pandemic, at least as far as conversation starters. I know at a student learning center training that we had at the end of spring quarter, we had tutors just share out what they were listening to get through the pandemic. And I think we still have to create a Spotify playlist based on that. But we came up with some good songs, a good list of songs that people were listening to get through the pandemic. And I was at a recent state meeting where we used a discussion about food as an icebreaker. What are you eating, ordering, preparing? What recipes are you drawing on to help you get through the pandemic? So definitely food and music are two of the biggest animating topics for people right now.
Yeah. Or what are you watching?
Yep.
Right. That's, I think, another one that breaks the ice really well. And I think oftentimes, especially with theater games or engagement work, there's often this perception that it's going to take a lot of time, or that it's going to eat up all your class time. If every single student was talking about their favorite food, right? Like that would just take up too much time. We don't have time to do it. The quarter's we're already all stressed, right? It's already midterms. And I think sometimes just even a poll on Zoom or a chat storm, right, where you just type the question in the chat and have people answer in the chat, takes 2 minutes. People get to see other people responding, even if it's just the food question for the second time that quarter. It creates that engagement. And it seems so small, and it seems like, what is a minute of a chat storm of food? But it does create engagement, and it creates community, because one student sees another student type something they like. And it's like, I'm connecting. Like even that small little connection can really help create community and build engagement.
And it also gives you ideas for things you can steal, like, what am I going to make for dinner tonight?
Yeah, what am I going to add to my playlist? And what do I want to watch this weekend? Yeah, I agree.
What are you watching to get through the pandemic?
Like many, I've turned to Netflix and have just gone down many rabbit holes. I just started Deaf U, which is a documentary about Gallaudet University over on the East Coast, which is an entirely deaf university. Everything's in sign language, and it's run, the staff are all deaf, the administrators are all deaf, and it's for deaf students. And so that's been a really interesting Netflix show to watch.
Is it a series or is it a documentary?
It's like one season, but it's like a reality show.
Nice.
So that has been fun. And yeah, I think what I love about my weekly social, because another thing that we're doing is I've been a part of the affinity group lounges at North Seattle College, which are weekly virtual lounge spaces based on identity groups that are marginalized. And so I'm the advisor for the LGBTQ affinity lounge. And so, again, it's a weekly meeting on Zoom for students to just come hang out and talk and chat, very casual environment. But I think just students knowing that it exists is helpful, oh, there is a space if I ever want to go to it. But I feel very fortunate and grateful that I get to be in those spaces, because I do learn about so many new things. And I learn from our students, like, what are they dealing with and what are the challenges they face? And sometimes it's like, you know what, this week, we just don't have any more energy for being on Zoom, like many of us, right? I think a lot of our students are just over Zoom. You and I probably are as well.
For sure.
Yeah. And so we'll just keep our cameras off, play music, and just, sort of be in the space without engaging in Zoom. But again, you wouldn't think that creates community or builds engagement, but just knowing that we're all there if we do want to talk, I think is just so important. So,
and the affinity groups can be found in the Equity and Welcome Center at North Seattle College. Is that correct?
Yes, it's on the EDI website, which I will share in the links for this podcast.
We'll put them in the program notes.
I do want to give a shout out to the tutoring center as well, because it's not just the affinity lounges, but the tutoring center has created some really great virtual spaces for students to study and some workshops and some, really great partnerships with our counseling department. So I want to give a little shout out to the Student Learning Center. I don't know if you know anything about it, Dan.
Yeah, I do know something about the Student Learning Center. I think I've heard something about it through the grapevine. For those listening who don't know, in addition to helping with the management of the Teaching and Learning Center, I also am the director of the Student Learning Center at North Seattle College. And I agree with you, Renee. I think we've done the Student Learning Center and the faculty coordinators and the tutors who work in there have done a really good job of trying to recreate the physical space in a virtual environment. So the student in general has as much of the same experience coming into the SLC online as they would if they were coming into our physical space. And like all of us, we've probably focused too much on technical training as far as Zoom and Starfish and a lot of other applications. We have been spending some time in our trainings thinking about the interpersonal aspects of our work and how to build community and how to foster belonging in the center and make a welcoming environment for our students in an online environment. So, and all of those things are incredibly important. Thank you for mentioning the Student Learning Center.
I will say one of the number one things I hear from students, both international, especially international, but also with our domestic students, is how vital the tutoring center is to their student experience in general, and how everyone should use the tutoring center and just what a wonderful place it is. And I think that speaks to this idea of engagement and how we engage students. And the reason why students like it so much is because the tutoring center is doing a good job of not just being like, here's your homework help, but like treating students beyond just the work, right? So
yeah, and we know that is the key to retention and success for our students, helping them feel a sense of belonging and connection to the academic environment. And you work in advising, and we work one-on-one in the Student Learning Center with students through tutoring. I'm sure we both have had experiences with students who are reticent or hesitant about reaching out for services, which makes it all the more imperative to really work on creating an environment that makes them feel welcome and where they feel belonging and where they feel a connection with the people that they're working with, because that will keep them coming back to use the services again and again, hopefully.
Yeah, it's interesting because sometimes especially in student services, where it can feel really transactional, like these sort of interactions with students where it's like, hello, what class would you like to take? Okay, take this class. Great, thank you. Bye-bye. In a 30-minute advising appointment, for example, it can feel really challenging to make time for that engagement piece. And just like in the classroom, and I think it's rethinking what engagement needs to be, and that it doesn't need to be this huge time-consuming thing so much as a quick, like, how are you? How are classes going? Not every student needs that, not, it's not going to work for every situation, but, sometimes just that quick check-in I know it's opened up students that I didn't even, I wasn't even expecting, where a student then starts talking to me about like, oh, it's been really hard with COVID. I'm like, yeah, I really feel that. And that makes the appointment just go, it really helps me to do my job as an advisor, because then we have this rapport. I can really ask those questions like, do you really want to be a computer science major? Or are you doing it for your mom? Right? So I think those, you just never know how it's going to work. And so I think like, because studies show and experience shows that it often leads to students having better retention rates, right? Like you were saying. So
yeah, this conversation reminds me of the work that our faculty counselors, Jenny Mao and Sarah Fletcher, and I are working on with the Fun Games and Wellbeing online cafe that we host every Wednesday at 2 p.m., where we invite students to come in and participate in a game or some sort of arts activity. And that is a vehicle to get them through the door or the virtual door so that they can meet the counseling faculty and develop a relationship with them and learn how to seek them out when they might need their services. The games and activities are a way for them to build trust with the counseling faculty.
Before we move on, Dan, have you played any fun games in those sessions that you really like?
Well, we did play Two Truths and a Lie, which I really liked, and that involves each person taking a turn and telling three stories. Two of the stories are true and one's a lie. And one thing I did learn from that activity was not to get too specific with the details or provide too many specific details, because that serves as a tell that the story you're telling is probably true for you to come up with that many specific details. So don't do that if you play Two Truths and a Lie. But I do have another game that I would recommend. That's a theater type game that you could do in an online environment. It's called Dictionary. And it, of course, serves to help people develop their vocabulary skills. And it could work like a game of popcorn in a Zoom session. And for those who are not familiar with Zoom popcorn games, it's where a person introduces him or herself or themselves. And then it calls on another person to introduce themselves, and so forth. And so it becomes like a popcorn machine in the online environment. This dictionary game would involve one person introducing a vocabulary word, and then calling on somebody else to provide the definition of a vocabulary word, and then that person calling on another person to provide an example sentence with that vocabulary word, and maybe even calling on a few other people, like popcorn, to provide further sentences as examples of how to use the word correctly. So that's a theater game that I think could be useful for especially ESL students or international students or even a vocabulary-intensive workshops.
It reminds me, and this might be good for, sort of our English faculty as well, of the build a story through like with one word, which is a fun improv game that goes way back, but essentially
you looked at my notes, Renee.
I did not. I was saying that, like, that reminded me of that, which is you start a story and one person says one word and then the next person says another word, and it's literally built one word by one word from each student. And so
one way I think an activity like that could be used is to help students work on summaries and paraphrasing one word at a time. So after they read something or a passage or a text, they could summarize it or even paraphrase it as a group, one word at a time, as an online activity.
Yeah. I mean, I think, right, again, a lot of these techniques can be easily tied to lessons or tied to learning and tied to teaching. And I think it's just a matter of, sort of understanding the nature of what you're doing. And I think bringing it to the table and trying it. Because a lot of times we don't even try these things. And it's like, who knows what's going to work, especially in COVID. Right now, I'm like, if now's not a time to try theater games in your classroom, like, when is?
Yeah, even if it's out of sheer desperation.
Right. I mean, let's try it all, because COVID has been a time for us to all, reset and rethink and re-strategize what we do, I think, in a lot of ways. And I'm all for it.
So at some point, we are going to be going back to face-to-face service or some level of face-to-face service. Knock on wood, and I am knocking on my head right now. So knock on wood, that will happen. What do you think you've learned from this experience during remote operations? And what do you think you've learned from this experience that you're going to bring back with you when we do go back to some level of face-to-face service?
Well, I think it's definitely confirmed that I'm much more of an in-person type worker. And not that I didn't know that already, but wow, did this really confirm that? I think it's really made me appreciate, especially for international students, how much like gathering spaces and spaces where you casually interact with people are so crucial to our students' learning. Because I think about the Grove, for example, which is North's cafeteria space or gathering space, and how much informal and formal learning was happening just by people being around each other, right? And interacting and seeing other people and saying hi, and how that sparks ideas and creativity and sort of like connection. And so for me, in my work, just wanting to really amp that up even more, and again, thinking about it and like, how can we do it with a COVID sort of safe way, right? Because we're all going to be a little hesitant to get near people, right? So thinking about, just being creative in our use of space and our use of connecting and gathering. I'm really looking forward to seeing how we can do that, as a college, and wanting to create those spaces, because a lot of the feedback I get from international students is that they are having a tough time because they don't have that in-person experience. Mm-hmm. And so really looking forward to that and being able to like serve our students in that way. And I think, we know that's true. And it's why we have women's centers on campus and equity centers on campus, right? Because we know that gathering spaces help create that sense of connection. So I'm really looking forward to going back.